to the Advancing Organisational Child-Safe Practices Using Contextual Prevention Strategies Symposium. This symposium is hosted by Australian Catholic University's Institute of Child Protection Studies and the University of the Sunshine Coast Sexual Violence Research and Prevention Unit. So as Nadine said, my name's Douglas Russell, and I'll be facilitating today's symposium, but we have a range of speakers to guide us through understanding contextual prevention strategies a bit better. We're very excited about presenting this project to you. Our varied audience come from practice organisations, government, national centres with a focus on child sexual abuse prevention, and even over 100 international registrants. They may be here now, or they may be watching the recording later on. So welcome to everyone. With that in mind, just one more reminder, we are recording the symposium. So if you want to make any changes to your video or name, please do so. It's customary in Australia to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet, and we'd like to do that for the traditional custodians for the lands that we're on here at ICPS and up at the University of the Sunshine Coast at the Sexual Violence Prevention and Research Unit. And but also to pay our respects to First Nations people globally who may have been affected by colonisation. We understand that Australia was not the only country where this has happened. So we'd like to pay our respects to the ancestors, elders and descendants of these lands and all lands. Please feel free to acknowledge the lands of the people who you're joining us from today. Thank you. So this was a collaborative project, and there's many people that we need to thank, and we want to do that right now from the onset so that you can understand the context of the study and the work that we're presenting. So I'll start with our funder. Our funder was Westpac, and it was through a Safer Children, Safer Communities grant that we were able to take this project on board and to do it with our partners. And those partners were 54 Reasons and Life Without Barriers. And we've worked over the last couple of years on this project, and there have been some challenges, and you'll hear about those in the symposium today, but there's also been lots of opportunities and things that we've learned as a result of doing this project. And I hope that our partners at 54 Reasons and Life Without Barriers, I know many of whom are here today, also found this to be a great learning opportunity as well. As I said, the hosts of the symposium are the two research institutes that used this grant to conduct the project. And that is my wonderful colleagues, Nadine and Sue from the University of the Sunshine Coast, and myself and Professor Daryl Higgins from the Institute of Child Protection Studies. So I'll just introduce each of them now briefly. So the first person that I'd like to introduce is Natasha Menzies, who's the Executive Manager for Social Programs and Human Rights, and also works on the Safer Children, Safer Communities project at Westpac. We've got Professor Daryl Higgins, Director of the Institute of Child Protection Studies, Chief Investigator of the Australian Child Maltreatment Study, which I know we'll be talking about briefly today. Associate Professor Nadine McKillop, who's co-leader of the Sexual Violence Research and Prevention Unit at the University of the Sunshine Coast, and Dr. Susan Raymond McHugh, who's a Senior Lecturer and Researcher and co-leader as well at the Sexual Violence Research and Prevention Unit at the University of the Sunshine Coast. And then last of all is myself, Douglas. I'm a Senior Researcher here at the Institute of Child Protection Studies, and you'll be able to, if you're interested in seeing more about the other work that each of us does, or more about what Westpac's been doing with the Safer Children, Safer Communities grant, there will be some links getting posted in the chat to help you with that. So moving on from there, I believe that I'm going to be handing over to Natasha, who's going to give a brief introduction and explanation of child safeguarding at Westpac. And then Natasha, when you're done, you're welcome to hand over to Daryl, who's going to cover the first section of our symposium. Thanks so much, Natasha.
Thanks, Douglas. Hi, everyone. My name is Natasha Menezes. I look after child safeguarding, human rights, and social risk at Westpac. And I'm really grateful that the Australian Catholic University and the University of the Sunshine Coast invited me here today to tell you about Westpac's commitment to child safeguarding. Just for context, as part of the Safer Children, Safer Communities program, we were able to fund 7 research institutes. I think so. Okay. One of which was ACU. And the reason we decided to do that was because we realized that quality research and the development of new evidence-based approaches is absolutely essential to tackling the problem of child abuse, child sexual abuse, and exploitation. So it's great to see the progress that Daryl, Douglas, Nadine, and Susan and their teams have made over the last 2 years of the partnership. On this slide, what I want to show you is that when we were thinking of developing the Safer Children, Safer Communities program in 2019, we thought of it holistically. So the overall program, and if you just type Safer Children, Safer Communities Westpac, you'll find a link to our website where we've got detailed information on everything. But the program essentially involves a series of actions and investments that we are delivering across Australia and Asia. And our efforts have been focused across 4 areas. So there's catalyzing change, which is within the bank, things that we're doing to create deeper awareness. There's raising awareness not just within Australia, but across the nation. There's accelerating unity of action, and we've got a key partner with ICMEC Australia. I'll talk a little bit about that in the presentation. And then our grants programs, including funding of research, falls under the 4th one, which is where we look to help protect children. I want to acknowledge that this program has required a collective effort. It's not just been Westpac. We've sought the expertise and support from a range of different stakeholders. We have an SCSE roundtable, which has experts from a range of fields. We've had an advisory group of NGOs which have guided us along the way. We've had different partners that have stepped in at different times to provide us with input and feedback from on the ground. We've had over 50 grant recipients that we've supported, and very importantly, Westpac employees as well, who've taken on a lot of actions and delivering a lot of progress within the bank. If you go onto our website and have a look at Westpac's approach to child safeguarding, one of the things that will come up is our child safeguarding position statement. We're one of the first banks in Australia, and I think globally as well, to have a standalone approach on child safeguarding. And on this slide, you'll see the 4 areas that we're committed to. It was quite interesting because when we started to develop this, it was hard to find examples of organizations that don't work directly with children and young people. But what we recognized was that the need for a child-safe culture extends beyond those orgs that work directly with children and young people. And as a bank, we especially had an important role to play because finance just impacts so many different areas. And while we know that we cannot entirely eliminate risks to children and young people, we have a role to play across different areas. So after taking a due diligence approach and a human rights approach, we identified that these 4 areas, so there's safety by design across our products and services, there's consideration of child labor risks in our supply chain, there's child exploitation risks across our financial transactions, and strengthening grievance mechanisms for children and young people. These were the 4 areas that we wanted to play the most important role in. And we've got a range of actions which are also public and available on our website. So please have a look when you have a chance. This is one example that I wanted to provide you with on how we think about risk to children and young people at Westpac. So as you know, we provide a range of financial services, whether it's bank accounts, debit cards, to children and young people. And what we realized is we needed to think about it from a safety by design approach. So you'll see in that table within the picture, there were a range of changes that we've made to accounts held by children under the age of 14. So a signatory is always required to open an account. We recognize that not all children might have parents or carers, but grandparents play an important role as well. So giving them the opportunity to become signatories. We also recognize that any changes to the card could not just be made by children, but needed the approval of the signatory, and that no joint accounts for a child could be held under the age of 14. And there's a range of other things we've done as well. So we've put blocks on things like gambling. They can't go into like merchant facilities and buy a range of different products like alcohol, etc. So we're constantly thinking about safety by design. And it's one of the things we worked very closely with the E-Safety Commissioner's Office to design and develop. One of the things we committed to right at the start was publicly disclosing how we were progressing against our child safeguarding performance. So again, this information is available on our website, and this is just a snapshot of things we've been able to deliver over FY23. What I'd like to call out here is in FY23, we reached 257,000 children, young people, and adults through our funding. And since 2020, we have actually committed $61 million in funding across Australia and Asia, specifically for child safeguarding programs. Next slide, please. There's two key things that we are currently focused on. So this is the On Us Coalition for Safeguarding Children. What we realized is that Westpac alone, or one bank alone, can't change things, and we need other businesses to take the same journey that we did. So we provided funding to the Australian Childhood Foundation to create a business coalition and work with businesses that had limited awareness of the potential impact of their operations and activities on children and young people. And this is a cross-sector initiative, and we're proud to say that in addition to Westpac, the other founding members of this coalition include IG Hotels and Resorts, GPT Group, TikTok, TBWA, and then there's a few others as well. So go online, have a look at this. There's more information on their website. If you just look up Australian Childhood Foundation and On Us Coalition, you can get a lot more information on this. And finally, the last slide that I want to leave you with is another partnership that we're quite proud of. So we provided, in 2021, we partnered with ICMEC Australia, which is the International Centre for Missing and Exploited Children. We provided them $25 million to foster industry collaboration and exchange information and data sets. What happens is different banks have different data sets of a potential perpetrator, but because of the privacy regulations, we're not able to share that quite openly. And what this partnership is trying to do is enhance the ability of different actors within the financial services sector to detect and report suspicious financial transactions and provide crucial evidence to investigators. And throughout our 4-year partnership with ICMEC, they've been able to use their stakeholder base to just initiate a range of different collaborations and relationships between financial service organizations, law enforcement, government, and NGOs. So that's where I'll leave you. If you have any questions, feel free to have a look on our website. There's also an email address there, and we'd be more than happy to share more information. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Natasha. It's lovely to have that overview, and we're particularly appreciative of the funding that Westpac has provided to us here at ACU and our colleagues at UniSC in order to be able to conduct this research. So, so thank you for your commitment to child safeguarding and enabling this work that we're presenting today. So what I'm going to do is give a little bit of an overview, both of the history of child sexual abuse prevention, but also a quick reminder of the prevalence. I'm one of the chief investigators on the Australian Child Maltreatment Study, which is the first national prevalence study that's comprehensive of all forms of child abuse and neglect. And it was led by my colleague, Professor Ben Matthews from QUT. with a number of us contributing to that study. And you can see here on the screen that it is a large-scale study, so over 8,500 participants, some of those young people aged 16 to 24, and then going right back through the different age groups to the 65 plus in order to be able to tell about changes in prevalence over time. And so what you can see on the next slide is the key finding that many of you probably will have already encountered. We've had a lot of publicity for this, but what we found was that over 1 in 4 Australians have experienced child sexual abuse. It might have been a form of contact child sexual abuse, and you can see on the left-hand side of the little graph on the right-hand side was experienced by 23.7% of the population, 18% experiencing non-contact sexual abuse. And the 3 types of contact sexual abuse, you can see the percentages for each of those. And of course, the unfortunate reality is that many Australians experience not one, but in fact more than one type of child sexual abuse. The average, the typical, was actually 3.5 different child sexual abuse experiences. But these experiences are not borne evenly by men and women. So women were much more likely in our study to tell us that as children they experienced sexual abuse. And in fact, in almost all settings, the only one where it was not true that women were more likely to have experienced child sexual abuse was in institutional contexts. So certainly it means that we need to be doing something to address the context, if you like, of why it is that women are at greater risk of experiencing this form of adversity during their childhood. But to break it down by who it is and the context in which child sexual abuse occurs, on the next slide, you can see the proportion of the population. So this is not a percentage of those who experience sexual abuse, but this is in a proportion of the entire population who experience sexual abuse by different classes of offenders. And this analysis was led by my colleague, Ben Matthews. And what we can see here is that 7.8% of the population experienced sexual abuse by a parent or caregiver in the home, 7.5% by another adult who they knew, 4.9% by someone who was an adult who they didn't know, 2% were by an institutional adult caregiver. But on the right-hand side is too often missed out groups, and that's sexual abuse at the hands of a known adolescent, and 12.9% of the population experienced that, and an additional 1.4% experiencing sexual abuse at the hands of an unknown adolescent. So that's the context that we need to be thinking about it. So in terms of the history of prevention of child abuse and neglect, I was just moving offices the other day and came across this book that I've had in my collection for a number of years now. 1990 it was published, and I went through it just to see, well, what were we saying back then about child sexual abuse prevention? And some of the key messages absolutely still resonate right now. So firstly, the message is not just to think about what we call secondary and tertiary prevention. So dealing with high-risk populations, or targeting our programs to those who are at higher risk, we actually need to focus our attention on primary preventions. So like we have done with, say, dental health, and directing interventions at the entire population by putting fluoride in the water, we actually want to do things that are actually stopping sexual abuse from happening in the first place. We also need to work with potential perpetrators early in their lives, particularly given the data that I've just shared about the proportion of the population who experience sexual abuse at the hands of an adolescent, how we can stop those who have concerning thoughts or desires towards children, including those who are at risk of or are engaging in harmful sexual behaviour towards their peers, from getting help so that they don't continue to do so, but also addressing the vulnerability of potential victims. And key across all of the different types of strategies that Cohn and colleagues have pointed out in this book, we can see that there's a number of assumptions that prevention programs are based on. Firstly, it's multi-problem. It's complex, and so we actually need to have multiple strategies. That we actually have had limited empirical findings about the causes. And of course, since 1990, that's an area that's been growing, but there's still a lot of data that we don't know about risk factors, particularly ones that are specific to sexual abuse, as opposed to other forms of child abuse and neglect. We also know that abusers don't have a single profile, so it's really hard to focus just on perpetrators and how we can weed them out of organisations in order to make things safer for children. We know that abusive behaviour can start early, before adulthood, so we have to keep adolescents in mind, not just adults, particularly within organisational contexts. And that's, I think, going to be a really strong argument for the value of what we're going to be talking about today. We also know that we have to have community change, and we need to have really robust taboos about molesting children conveyed through the media. A key assumption, though, and this is an area that has had a lot of attention, is that we need to be able to teach children about how to resist attempts to have sexual abuse inflicted on them. But we also need broader understanding by the entire population. But really importantly, and again, directly relevant to what we're talking about today, we need to be able to address when children are in unsafe or non-protected environments. So what does a comprehensive approach to prevention mean? And again, this is drawing on work that Cohn published back in 1990. We need to have things like education for adolescents and older children about healthy sexuality. We need to train adults to be able to identify abuse and screen out those who are unsuitable to be working with them. We need to have prevention education for children, teaching them about things like how to protect themselves, but more importantly, how to reach out for help when they feel a situation is not okay or they feel unsafe. Educating parents, including information about appropriate and inappropriate touch and how to react when they see signs of inappropriate behaviour. And of course, implementing what we now know as child-safe processes or strategies within organisations. And we're very lucky here in Australia that we have national principles for child-safe organisations and most jurisdictions working towards a legislative framework in order to ensure that all youth-serving organisations comply with child-safe principles or requirements. But for that to really flow through, we have to have education for the public so that everybody, including adults and adolescents, know that sexual abuse is a crime, that it's a chronic and frequent problem, that children cannot consent to sexual interaction with adults, and that they get hurt by sexual abuse. And then messages for children themselves that they can say no, that it's not their fault and that help is available. And of course, treating perpetrators so that they don't continue to be a risk to children, because we know that once someone acts in a way that is unsafe towards children, the likelihood is that they have done already and are likely to do so again. So the focus of some of these early approaches that we've had, I think, can be kind of grouped together into two different groups. One is victim-focused programs. So the key here is what we call protective behaviours programs, which have now been kind of revamped and rebranded as child sexual abuse prevention education, where there's a lot of focus on understanding these rules about body safety, what's okay, what's not okay. But an unfortunate side effect of having these really important programs is that it can inadvertently send the message to children and young people that they are responsible for keeping themselves safe, as opposed to adults and the environments that we should be responsible for being the main focus of attention. Secondly, other than victim-focused programs, we've had a lot of focus on perpetrator interventions in order to, firstly, try and stop someone who might be wanting to perpetrate child sexual abuse from getting involved in an organisation. So we have what's called pre-employment screening. You will often refer to it as working with children checks, criminal history checks, in order to understand, has somebody already engaged in inappropriate or harmful behaviour before, and exclude them from involvement with an organisation. But moving on for that, there's been more focus recently on what we call suitability assessment. So not just having a a clear ticket, if you like, with there being no abject finding from a criminal history assessment or working with children check, but rather understanding, why do you want to work with this youth serving organisation? How do you work with children and young people? What do you do to ensure their well-being and safety? And really getting a good match between the values of the organisation and an individual worker or volunteer. And that includes things like, sports coaches, teachers, volunteers in, faith-based organisations, etc. Goes right across all youth-serving organisations. And then thirdly, adding to that suite of stopping people from getting into organisations, it's also about making sure that when something happens that is untoward and someone has breached a code of conduct or engaged in a behaviour that could be part of a grooming process towards sexual abuse, that it is actually reported. And there are schemes in place now to make sure that that is done in a robust way. And it's not just about criminal checks, it's actually about broader misbehaviour by adults, so that we start to build up a picture of people who might be working towards engaging in a sexually abusive behaviour. So altogether, though, these things have really focused on individuals. And the purpose of today is to try and get our attention focused a little bit more broadly. If we think about prevention from, routine activities theory and other sources, we actually understand that three things have to co-occur in order for abuse or in fact, any criminal behaviour to really be occurring. We have to have motivation of an offender. We have to have vulnerability of a potential victim, but we also have to have opportunity. And of the three things, what are the things that we are likely as a youth serving organisation to have most control over? It's actually about opportunity. So it's lovely to be able to think about how we can bring those three things together in order to try and have a systemic, organised focus towards reduction of risk of child sexual abuse occurring. So to do that, it does mean shifting the paradigm. So moving our eyes away from just focusing on bad people, or in fact from at-risk people, and instead moving our focus on to the strategies that an organisation might use. And some of the reasons why it's not adequate to just focus on individuals, be they victims that we're wanting to try and protect, or potential offenders who we're wanting to screen out and weed out, is, of course, a first-time abuser has no offence history to get detected. So we will never be successful if we only have individually focused approaches to prevention at weeding out those who haven't yet offended but are likely to and may do so in the future. Also, although it's changing, and of course the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse has been integral in this, in raising awareness of changes across society to understand the prevalence and the impacts of child sexual abuse, we still know that there's a lot of shame attached to experiencing child sexual abuse, and many people don't speak up about it. So if it's not reported and organisations don't know about it, it's very difficult for anyone else in the future to then detect it. As I said before, we know that sexual abuse doesn't just happen at the hands of adults. We know that it happens at the hands of other children and young people as well. And so that's not going to be resolved through a working with children check or a criminal history check. And finally, focusing on the individual, whether it be the perpetrator or the victim, really ignores the power of the situation to influence individual behaviour. And so we need to be able to really have a systemic approach to prevention that focuses on those broader contexts. So to do that, in the next slide, you can see some of the new approaches. We're really wanting to have prevention education move beyond protective behaviours to be much more comprehensive. And that really requires coalition with sex educators as proponents not just of children's health, but of their safety. We have to involve parents, so including them in either child-focused or more broadly, directly influencing them with their knowledge about the prevalence of child sexual abuse, but also what they can do, the kind of behavioural strategies that they can adopt in the home and more broadly in the community, such as monitoring, supervision, taking care around delegating care. So, when perhaps their child is sleeping over at, a cousin's house, et cetera, et cetera. We also need to deal with societal mores. And of course, we've had lots of examples lately of the problems of toxic masculinity and the sexualization processes that men are subjected to in our society. We've also got some innovations in perpetrator interventions and programs such as Stop It Now that are supports for adults or for young people who are concerned about their own or somebody else's thoughts towards children. And I've mentioned before the adoption of child-safe principles or standards. But more directly to what we're going to be talking about today, we've also had a stronger focus on the environment. So we've had research that has that has looked at the role of understanding the situation, referred to as situational crime prevention. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about that. And of course, bringing it all together is what we call contextual prevention. It's really the new kid on the block. What do we mean by this? We're going to be exploring it in the rest of today's webinar. We're talking about a comprehensive approach to the prevention of child sexual abuse that includes strategies that are focused on individuals, but also on the context in which they are living, working, playing, and existing. So contextual prevention targets what we call societal context, so those broad things, including the sort of socialization experiences of males and females, but also deals with the more immediate situations, the micro. And so it can incorporate many of the things that we've been learning from situational crime prevention around what is actually happening within an organisation or context, or within other contexts such as broader society, such as the family, etc. And so that's where I'm going to lead off and hand over to Nadine, who's going to talk us through what we've been doing in this project in order to define what we mean by contextual prevention and to lead us through some of the implications of our study work. So over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Daryl. Okay, so to provide you with some context, for want of a better word, to where we are at the moment, I wanted to really start by emphasising what has effectively been an almost 20-year journey in recognising and trialling situational contextual prevention approaches within the sector. In fact, it was in 2006 that Professor Richard Wortley and Professor Stephen Smallbone edited a seminal collection of works that introduced the application of situational prevention of child sexual abuse in crime prevention studies. Then we fast forward to 2012, and we see the announcement of the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. And across 5 years and amongst several public and private hearings, roundtables, commissioned research, consultation papers, and so on, we witness this proliferation of evidence recognising just the importance of situational prevention approaches to understanding and preventing child sexual abuse. And I just note a couple here for you to have a look at. Now, the final report released in 2017 detailed 409 recommendations on how to improve laws, improve policies, and improve practices to prevent and better respond to child sexual abuse in institutions. And as Kaufman and colleagues stated in their research at that time, rather than focusing solely on individuals, risk management also needs to address environmental factors. Thus, a criminological approach provides a framework for examining the contextual and situational risks that increase the potential for crimes to occur in a given setting. And then Professor Stephen Smallbone noted in regards to the impact of the Royal Commission on youth serving organisations that the Royal Commission has done a great deal to demolish the idea that organisations have been simply hapless victims of mysterious sexual predators, and that all they can really do by way of prevention is to keep such predators out of their organisation. On the contrary, he said, because they can exert a great deal of control over the design and the operation of organisational settings, organisations are particularly conducive to place-based prevention methods. And this realisation seems to be the main reason why many organisations are embracing situational prevention as a way to analyse and manage their particular risks within their organisation. Then in 2018, the National Principles for Child-Safe Organisations are published. And on the wheel of child safety, as Daryl mentioned before, Principle 8 highlights again the necessity for physical and online environments that promote the safety and well-being while minimising the opportunity for children and young people to be harmed. Now, at the same time, there is a flurry of action by youth serving organisations interested and eager to learn more about these approaches, and requests for consultation and training activities to upskill staff and to assess existing policies and practices. Now, on the back of that work that we have been doing and ACU has been doing within the sector, in 2022, our team was awarded the Westpac Safer Children, Safer Communities grant to partner with our national youth serving organisations to pilot some of these contextual prevention strategies. And we partnered with 54 Reasons and Life Without Barriers for this project. Now, as I'll allude to in more detail in a moment, the piloting of and evaluation of these strategies and some of the sort of challenges we faced, both for us as researchers and our partners, forced us really to regroup, to pivot, and to really reflect on what next. So before I share my reflections or our reflections on the challenges for implementation, I want to begin by stating upfront that innovation takes time, it takes patience, and it certainly takes perseverance. The Royal Commission set up a number of key opportunities for enhanced policy and practice across the sector. And there has certainly been a significant commitment by youth serving organisations to assess, revise and update current child-safe policies and practices against best practice standards. And indeed, there's been a widespread interest by youth serving organisations in the idea of contextual prevention and its potential to complement current practices. There's also been some in-principle support by youth serving organisations to outsource experts to assess existing approaches and to contemplate the introduction of new strategies. So this led to an uptake in consultation requests and probably most of all, an investment in staff training to upskill employees on situational and contextual approaches. And there's also been some ad hoc experimentation of innovative contextual prevention strategies outside of the mainstay of training activities. However, I think it is a fair assessment to say that we remain in the embryonic stages of implementation across the board. So while some strategies have been piloted, training to upskill staff has been the main strategy used, and rightly so, I think, because it is something that is already heavily embedded into existing organisational practices. There is still a heavy reliance on stamping out bad apples and less so on the bad barrel. And I think this is understandable as well, because situational and contextual approaches by their design assume a universal potential to abuse and concentrate therefore on reducing opportunities. And this is less palatable to many, is psychologically challenging for some, and tests the not in my backyard mindset. More broadly, implementation has to date lacked a systematic approach. As you all would know and understand all too well, I imagine, time and resource constraints can impede opportunities to adequately plan, pilot and evaluate at whole of organisation. And funding timelines and deliverables often associated with testing such approaches can also constrain the time necessary for full implementation and evaluation. There are also competing priorities and agendas to sufficiently focus on and embed new strategies into practice, despite all good intentions and support. After all, this is only one component in a large operation of activities for any one organisation. And this oftentimes leads to that sporadic uptake and engagement and limited implementation within and across organisations. So as I mentioned before, as a team, we were forced to stop and reflect on this longer history of challenges with implementation, reflecting on 20 years of sporadic uptake and integration of these types of ideas into practice. And these reflections really forced us to consider, did we run before we could walk? Reflecting more, we concluded that youth serving organisations are undoubtedly interested in contextual prevention. They absolutely have an appetite for it, but are still not quite sure what is meant by contextual prevention or what it looks like in practice. Indeed, we wondered if an important step had been overlooked in our anticipation and our excitement of implementing innovative ways to support existing prevention practice. And perhaps we should have taken more heed of Professor Smallbone's earlier point that situational prevention has featured in the Royal Commission's work and seems to have a strong intuitive appeal among organisational leaders, albeit that its rationale and its methodology are often less well understood. And Professor Ben Matthews, who said, apart from the question of what measures institutions should adopt, an unexplored question is how to implement and regulate those measures. And the central questions then relate to implementation, to quality, consistency, practicability, and oversight and accountability. Hence, as a team, we decided during the project that to do contextual prevention justice, we needed to step back, we needed to regroup, and to pivot to create a foundational structure from which to move forward. Now, this leads me to introduce Sue, who is the actual lead author on our recent publication. And so she's probably the best placed to share with you some of the key messages from our article on conceptualising and operationalising the contextual prevention of child sexual abuse. And so, Sue, I'd like to welcome you into the presentation.
Thanks so much, Nadine, and thanks everybody for being here today to think critically about and learn more about contextual prevention. I will just begin with an apology. I have a voice injury and my voice quality wafts and wanes, so bear with me with that. I think Nadine mentioned that this project has given us the opportunity to pivot, to stop, to regroup, to rethink, to reflect, to critique, to debate, to research and to explore what on earth this actual thing is. What is contextual prevention? The definition we've landed on, contextual prevention of child sexual abuse, comprises prevention efforts that target the factors external to the individual, addressing macro and micro level structures to create safer environments for children. If you only take one part of that, if you only remember one part of that definition, the part that we want you to focus on the most is the last part. Create safer environments for children, because that really sits at the core of contextual prevention approaches. This is about preventing child sexual abuse by changing environmental factors to improve safety. It sits in direct contrast to those individually focused prevention efforts, which essentially focus on creating safer individuals. And as Daryl pointed out earlier, collectively and together, they provide a comprehensive approach to prevention. Now, in contextual prevention, we are interested in the places. Where do people spend their time? The spaces that children are playing in, the spaces where children are at school in or in childcare, the context in which children and adolescents and adults spend their time. We want to make these places safer. Now, ironically, whilst this is been a 20-year journey so far. There's some real benefits to this type of approach, and one of those is about the speed with which we can implement these sorts of activities and therefore speed up the gains that we might gather. So just to take, for example, if we were focused on working with perpetrators of child sexual abuse, which is also an important part of a comprehensive approach, we'd first have to identify who they were. Then we might need to wait for a legal proceeding to play out. Then we might need to put them into treatment for an extended period of time before we're going to start to see the safety or the change that we desire. In contrast, when we're talking about changing environments, changing factors in the environment to make them safer for children, that's something that we can achieve much more quickly. And that has to be a really good thing for prevention. So what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to begin with the what. What sort of strategies comprise contextual prevention? I'm then going to talk about the how. How do we do that? And I'm going to introduce you to a 5-step process to guide you through that in practice. I'm going to emphasize 3 key points, and I'd like you to focus on those as I'm speaking. First of all, there's a large scope of strategies that we can adopt under a contextual prevention umbrella. Secondly, our implementation of this needs to be intentional. This is not about an ad hoc throw a strategy here or one there. This is about thinking through what are the risks, assessing those, and then matching our prevention strategies to those risks. And finally, as you've probably already gathered because it's been mentioned a few times, context itself is going to influence how we implement contextual prevention. As I'm speaking, please think about your own context, the organisations you work in, the context you work in, the communities you work in, or the countries that you work in. What sort of risks are you seeing? What are the safety concerns for children? What are the contexts that you're working with? What sort of context can you influence? And what sort of prevention strategies might fit? So next, what I'm going to do is just talk about the 4 different types of strategies that we see as really comprising contextual prevention approaches. First, this really relies on our conceptualization of what context is actually all about. And most of us will immediately go to the work of Bronfenbrenner and others, sort of setting out that our context is that sort of, series of systems from macro to micro levels, from neighbourhoods and community settings, down to families and peer settings, all the way down to the individual. And this is an important part of our conceptualization of context. But we have added a criminological lens to that as well, that situational crime prevention lens that criminology has gifted this field to extend that individual lens further to an even more micro level, down to the immediate situations in which adults and children or children and children might come into contact with each other and where abuse actually occurs. So we're wanting to think about the macro level, the neighbourhood and community systems that set the social conditions that impact our development and our behaviour, all the way through to the micro level where individuals interact with and are influenced by the social and physical environments in which they're embedded. So at a macro level, the sorts of strategies we're talking about are addressing the social determinants of child sexual abuse and enhancing formal regulatory controls, whereas at the micro level, we're talking about situational crime prevention and crime prevention through environmental design. So next, let me talk through addressing the social determinants of abuse and what that involves. This is about the drivers of abuse, the causes behind the causes. It's about the strategies that might address the social structures that are supporting or facilitating abuse, the norms and values that guide behaviour, or even the things like access to prevention resources or the sort of supports that are available for individuals. and families. So this might be challenging concerning social norms around gender equality or masculinity or male entitlement, or even about our understanding of the role of violence. It might be about strengthening protective norms through sort of focusing on respect and healthy relationships. It might be about improving access to resources for prevention or support, reducing exposure to concerning sexual behaviour, addressing disadvantage and poverty, or even developing sort of housing programs that might reduce overcrowding. Next, I want to talk about enhancing formal regulatory controls. What we're really talking about here is the legal and policy and protective systems that we have in place to protect children. This is about laws and legislation, organisational policies, both of which, or all of which, sort of set our standards of behaviour for our community or for our country or for our small organisation. It's also then about the quality, the availability and the accessibility of policing, child protection and other related services. So our prevention strategies here are about law reform, improving the laws and legislation we have to protect children from abuse. It's about policy reform, improving organisational policies, again to enhance safety for children, and it's about enhancing the protective systems that we have available to us. And probably this is the area that drew the most attention in the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse, in particular the gross failings that were reported and explored over and over again in organisational systems. So another important strategy in our contextual prevention repertoire. So next, I want to talk about situational crime prevention. Now, this is informed by rational choice and routine activities theories, and really influenced by the early work that Nadine mentioned before, the work of Richard Wortley, Stephen Smallbone, and Keith Kaufman. So this is about understanding that we can prevent crime, and in our case, prevent child sexual abuse, by altering physical or social aspects of a given situation that might otherwise have enabled or facilitated abuse. Now, it's beyond the scope of our seminar today to go into situational crime prevention in more detail. Needless to say, there are actually sort of 25 situational crime prevention techniques that have been sort of outlined and highlighted. Some in particular seem particularly relevant to the prevention of child sexual abuse. And I'll just talk briefly about 3 of those. Now, the first is about increasing effort, and that's the name of that's given to the strategy. This is about making offending behaviour more difficult to carry out. So, some of the kind of common examples that we might immediately turn to is controlling the access that people have to children in our organisational settings. It does include the screening of employees and volunteers, or in, say, a virtual setting, it might be about employing internet filters to limit sort of contact online. Another situational crime prevention strategy relevant here is increasing the risk of detection, and this involves extending active guardianship to reduce opportunities for abuse. Now, I'm using the term guardianship here from a criminological lens, not a legal lens. So I'm referring to safeguarding behaviour. And this might involve training, the sort of training that we have seen greater uptake of in this space in this country, training our staff in organisations to enhance their guardianship capacity, to give them the knowledge they need to identify concerns, to build their capacity for supervision, to help their willingness, capability and confidence to act out to protect children. This might involve training bystanders, so members of the public who might be able to also contribute to safety. Or alternatively, it might involve increasing the risk of detection by improving natural surveillance or formal surveillance so that we see what's going on. Or it might include work that improves opportunities for reporting abuse. And finally, removing excuses is another situational crime prevention strategy relevant here. This is how we clarify and set clear standards of behaviour. So next, And for our final kind of prevention strategy, just want to talk briefly about crime prevention through environmental design, also known as SEPTED, based on defensible space theory. Now, this, like situational crime prevention, is about altering the environment to reduce opportunities for crime. So it's about designing safe environments. And Natasha began today by talking about Westpac's Safety by Design program, which kind of fits into this category. Now, this is about identifying risks in the physical environment, in the processes that we use in an environment, the conditions in that environment, in order to reduce opportunity. So some of the examples we've got on the slide there come under the banner of improving natural surveillance. So if our concerns were in a public place, we might prune trees or add lighting or CCTV. If we're talking about perhaps an organisational setting, we might want rooms that have window panels or glass panels to enhance natural surveillance. Or in our domestic settings, we might move computers into the lounge room where there's more oversight and monitoring. From a controlling access perspective, another kind of SEPTED strategy, we might be looking at that safer recruitment strategies, or even monitoring visitors and looking at how visitors can interact in organisations. So that's really a snapshot of the what, a snapshot. And I encourage you to have a look at our articles, because we spell that out in a little bit more detail, and we'll be sending a copy of that to you following the seminar. So now let's turn to looking at the how. How do we implement contextual prevention? Now, we propose a very simple 5-step process for this. And the first step, which kind of seems simple but is really very important, is to define the space. Let's first define the context we're wanting to influence. Now, that might be at a big picture level, a whole of community setting, or a whole of organisation setting, or it might be smaller in terms of one part of an organisation, or it might be smaller again in terms of a room within an organisation. Or a space, like a location within a public setting, a park, for example, in a community setting. Or it might even include just a simple activity, so a school camp sort of environment, or a sleepover. So the scope here of what sort of context we define is quite large. What's important is that we define it, because that gives us the parameters for then moving to step 2, which is to assess what are the risks in that setting, in that context. Here we want to look at the nature of child sexual abuse in that particular defined setting. Who's involved? Where does it happen? When does it happen? Etc. What are the conditions that might precipitate offending motivations? We might want to assess the setting itself. What are the routine activities in this setting or activity or environment? What are the rules and policies that are in place? What are the opportunities for surveillance or not, or what might get in the way of that? What are the opportunities for grooming behaviour or for abuse to occur? What is the protective capacity? Where are the available guardians? Etc. And lastly, we might want to assess sort of relevant characteristics of the people involved and interacting in that setting. So guardianship capacity, any barriers to guardianship, and any specific personal vulnerabilities. At step 3, what we want to do is match those strategies, our prevention strategies, to those risks. So this is when we start to kind of go, okay, I've identified 5 primary risks in this setting. Now I go to that suite of prevention strategies, almost like I sit at a buffet and I work out which strategy is going to be best to address this particular risk. So this is where context is really going to influence what that looks like. So, for example, if the risk is opportunity, is a particular opportunity, how we tackle that is going to be different depending on the contextual circumstances. So, in one instance, we may want to train staff so that they improve their guardianship capacity. In another, we might want to change the physical structure of an organisation so that any visitors to the organisation have to go past reception first to reduce any opportunity for them accessing children. So that's going to be context specific. Steps 4 and 5 are about implementing these prevention strategies and, of course, and importantly, monitoring and evaluating those. Now, this is a simple 5-step process. It's following this sort of process that we think shifts contextual prevention from sort of ad hoc and responsive, sometimes even rushed, into a knowing before doing approach, into a considered and intentional uptake and implementation of contextual approaches to prevention. What I'm going to do now is just talk you through a couple of case studies, just to give you some examples of what this might look like in practice. And of course, there's any number of examples we could have chosen, and I've just chosen some to illustrate some differences in what this might look like. The first case study is about concerns at a specific school regarding sexualized behaviour between children, harmful sexual behaviour at that school setting. So we followed this 5-step process. We selected the target context. In fact, they selected themselves and approached us for some assistance with their concerns about this behaviour. We then moved to step 2 and undertook an assessment of the contextual risks. We did that in 2 primary ways. We spoke with teachers to better understand what they were witnessing and seeing and how they were feeling about their role in responding to this behaviour. And we undertook an environmental audit at the school to better understand the physical environment. What we discovered were underconfident teachers. Many of them were new graduates. They were dealing with this for the first time, and they lacked confidence to know how best to respond to this behaviour. We also identified that when the behaviour was mostly occurring during lunch break, while kids were playing in the playground, but on the audit showed us that the playground was actually really difficult to guard. It was one of those schools that had built up over time with a demountable building here and then another one added there and then another one added there. So it wasn't sort of designed from scratch. And so we had all these kind of hidden places in the playground that it actually made it very hard for teachers to guard, even when they were confident and even when they knew what they were looking for. We also noticed that there was limited visibility into classrooms. The school had actually been designed nicely with windows in all the classrooms, but because the buildings were a little bit run down, teachers had tried to make them a little bit prettier, a little bit more attractive to children, and popped up lovely pictures and posters and artwork and schoolwork over the windows to make it an inviting place for children. But in the same way, had actually prevented any sort of natural surveillance as somebody was walking past that classroom. So they were the risks we wanted to deal with. We then worked with the school community to match prevention strategies to those risks for implementation. What we ended up doing was training for teaching staff to enhance guardianship capacity. We worked with the school to increase the number of teachers on playground duty, just to mean that teachers could be in different places at the same time, watching over and guarding children whilst they were at play. And this was specifically to guard those really sort of the blind spots that we'd identified in the schoolyard. There was one area of the schoolyard that was particularly risky and particularly difficult to guard. It was behind some other buildings, and it was also had sort of some holes in the ground that children could even trip and fall into. So we worked with the school to actually board off that part of the playground so that children couldn't enter it at all. And finally, we worked with teachers on other ways to make the classrooms inviting and exciting and attractive and engaging for children, but still leaving those windows clear. That's one example at an organisational level. This next example is at a whole of community level. Now, my colleagues and I were asked to work with 2 communities. One was sort of in like a couple of suburbs in a metropolitan type of area, and the other was in a very remote First Nations community. So we worked with both communities separately. The goal was to create safer environments in order to create safety for children. So again, we followed this same 5-step process. We identified the settings. We then undertook an assessment of the contextual risks in those settings. We did that by undertaking community engagement, community interviews, talking to community leaders to get an understanding of the community setting, the environment, and also their concerns. We undertook sort of some observational Activities, like literally observing the areas that were of most concern to community members, and we undertook an environmental audit and some movement mapping type activities in that setting. That helped us to understand the sorts of things we needed to be dealing with. And then what was developed was this really comprehensive kind of prevention agenda. Now, it was co-designed with those community members, and it included multiple strategies. This is kind of where we get to see multiple strategies working together. So some of the strategies we implemented were designed to increase effort and risk of detection through enhanced guardianship. The list on the right-hand side of the slide, Teachers Protect, that was about training teachers. No surprise there. Professionals Protect was targeting other professionals working in these settings that may have played a protective role, and also working with parents to enhance their capacity for guardianship, and working amongst peer networks, amongst adolescent networks, to look at sort of peer support and safety. Some of the prevention activities we implemented were about reducing opportunities through environmental design. So we're looking at designing safe spaces. In one of those communities, the concern was particularly in relation to some parks. So it wasn't an organisational example, it was a public space sort of example. And what we did was work with the local council to look at sort of some pruning some trees, adding lighting, inviting other youth organisations into these spaces to make the use of the space a legitimate space where there were multiple sort of supervisors naturally there engaged in other activities. And finally, we worked on sort of some of the social determinants of abuse in these settings, working with communities. This was our Communities Protect activity, which was really about a lot of conversations with families, and then problem solving with community members about how to manage some of the norms that had developed that might have been contributing to a lack of safety. The next example I want to give you is from our project. So in our Westpac project, we worked with 54 Reasons and Life Without Barriers. And in this project, we asked the organisations to nominate one or two strategies that they had been implementing from a contextual prevention lens. And as Nadine mentioned earlier, it's no surprise that training was one of the ones that was raised by both organisations. Now, that makes sense on multiple levels because it's something organisations can do and can do well. And also, I think from a developmental perspective, this is probably where we begin our contextual journey. So we did have staff training going on. This was about enhancing guardianship capacity to reduce opportunities for abuse. There was lots of sort of different ways that training played out, online, in person. It included practice conversations and case studies. It was about increasing effort, increasing risk of detection. One of the organisations also was engaged with an environmental audit to identify potential risks, and the other had previously done some work on movement mapping with the same sort of idea, understanding the space and the use of space so that we can understand and address those risks better. This is about opportunity reduction, natural surveillance, and controlling access. All of these activities sat at that micro lens. Now, these are important strategies for enhancing contextual prevention of child sexual abuse, and the preliminary evaluation shows that they show promise as important strategies in our toolkit. But it does show us as well that there are many more opportunities to expand the scope of contextual prevention being implemented in youth serving organisations in Australia. Next, I just want to finish with a couple of international examples. And the reason I'm finishing with this is because they show us some incredible hope for what we can achieve. Now, the first is the work of Professor Keith Kaufman in the United States. Keith has been a leader in this field for a really long time. In fact, he contributed a chapter to that 2006 book that Nadine mentioned earlier, introducing a situational prevention approach that has some similarities with this step-by-step process we're introducing you to today. Now, his situational prevention approach has been adopted by a range of youth-serving organisations across the United States, including the Boys and Girls Clubs of America, children's hospitals, and even in university sort of settings. A more recent adaptation of Keith's work is this sports situational prevention model. So it shows us yet another way we might expand this contextual work. This work has been adopted by Olympic, Paralympic, elite and recreational sports programs to attend to safety concerns that are broad but include child sexual abuse. So the sports situational prevention model is implemented again in a stepped intentional process where entire sports teams are brought together to brainstorm the sorts of risks that they might be exposed to or concerned about, to then prioritise those risks out of the sort of recognising the reality that we can't actually, organisations can't implement 20 things at one time. Let's prioritise those, what we're going to target at any one point in time, then to work with those teams to kind of develop solutions, and then from there to create implementation plans. The other example is from the amazing Professor Carleen Furman. She's introduced contextual safeguarding as an approach to protecting young people from the harms they might experience outside of their family setting. So this is designed to make extra-familial environments safer for young people, in recognition that in adolescence, this is the environment that young people are spending more and more time with their friends, out socialising in the community. And this is where, of course, they can encounter risks. So again, in a similar sort of process to the one I outlined earlier, extra-familial settings in which young people are at risk of harm are identified. This might include schools, transport hubs, in entertainment venues, food outlets, the sorts of places young people spend their time. A contextual assessment is then undertaken to understand the experiences of young people in these high-risk settings, the level of available guardianship and other relevant contextual risks, and then key stakeholders from the community are identified and engaged, people that can contribute to safeguarding. So this might be business owners, local councils, transport providers, etc. And together they make a plan to make those settings safer for young people. Now, after being piloted and evaluated in the borough of Hackney in London, the contextual safeguarding approach in the UK has been scaled up nationally. So local authorities throughout the UK are adopting this contextual approach. There's also now sort of spread internationally with some international uptake of this same approach. And I'm finishing on this point because I think it shows us that even though sometimes shifting the way we focus, shifting the way we think, having to create new systems, to think outside the box, to move outside our comfort zone, even though that can be challenging for us, some amazing things can happen. We can implement it, we can scale it up if we put our mind to it. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Douglas, who's going to nicely take us through some future directions.
Thank you so much, Sue. So this is our last presentation section for the symposium, and I'll be focusing on, as Sue said, on future directions. So what's next for organisations, and how can you take what you've learned here today and apply it in your organisation or the context that you're working in? So that might be working with other organisations in some kind of consultancy role, or it might simply be in relation to community or even your home. So I can see lots and lots of questions coming through, so thank you very much. And I can see my wonderful colleagues answering those as we go. Please, if your question is still unanswered, or you'd like us to answer it at the end of the symposium, where we do have some time for Q&A. We'll also have a short feedback survey at the end through a QR code. It's very short, and you'll be able to complete it on your phone or device. I'll also get Maria to put the link in the chat. So hopefully now you have a better idea of what contextual prevention is. And contextual prevention of child sexual abuse comprises prevention efforts that target factors external to the individual that address macro level and micro level structures to create safer environments for children and young people. So if we think about the national principles and the associated child-safe standards that are getting developed that were mentioned earlier, to me, Principle 8 comes very much to mind, which focuses on physical and online environments. But at the same time, as has also been pointed out here, staff training, for example, has been occurring. And that can very often relate to contextual prevention because you're training your staff up in implementing or identifying contextual prevention. So you can involve families, communities, and young people in decision making. So again, both those other national principles or related standards also can, be associated with the work that you do in relation to contextual prevention. So just to recap before I move on, the three things that we've looked at so far. So we know that Daryl covered off on the ACMS findings and how important it is for us to considering how much sexual abuse has occurred in Australia, and indeed there's lots of international data as well, that we still need to strive to make organisations and our communities safer for children and young people, and that contextual prevention is a piece of the puzzle that we can use to do that. I want to thank Nadine for highlighting the challenges in implementing contextual prevention within organisations and with families. So there's lots of opportunities as well, and hopefully you'll go away after this section and after Sue's wonderful discussion and think, yes, there's some things we're doing, or there's some things that we're going to look at doing. So Sue definitely covered off how it's being implemented overseas and what we can do today. So I do, again, want to just thank those international people who are either watching now or watching the recording, because there definitely is space for this work to be happening internationally, and it'll be great to see how that happens moving forward. So a mapping and benchmarking exercise is a great first place to think about how you can apply what you've learned about contextual prevention here at the symposium. So this can help to understand the current state of play in your organisation or the context you're working in. So to do this, a program logic can be a really useful approach for understanding what outcomes or outcomes specifically you're looking for. So it's always great with a program logic, as many of you will know, to start with that problem statement and think about, with that problem in mind, what are the inputs that we're going to have into that system? Do we have some funds to support some kind of work? I know there were questions about protective behaviours programs and education. You can, fund external bodies to come in and do that kind of work. Or it might be that you've got people and you've got their skills, or you're going to upskill them to be the inputs into your program logic so that you can complete some activities. And we're going to go over some steps for doing those activities and what they might look like. And from there, obviously, you'll think about the outputs that you will produce as a result of those activities, and what are the short, medium, and long-term outcomes that you're hoping to achieve by putting those activities and strategies into place. So the first, there are 5 sort of steps here on this mapping and benchmarking exercise, which kind of work across and at the same time as the suggestions that Sue were making with those 5 steps. And so those are you already implementing some contextual prevention? Can you identify any contextual strategies through some kind of formal audit? Are you evaluating those strategies? Are they working? Are they achieving what you want them to achieve? Are there other contextual strategies out there? Do you have staff that have worked at other organizations that have ideas? Or do you have a network of people or a community of practice that you can engage with and share those ideas with? Or is that something we need to work on as a community together? And then developing in-house contextual strategies is another option. So again, going back to Sue's suggestion of having a look at our article, and I'll also talk about a tool that we've developed that complements the article and is based off the learnings in that article to help you. So let's talk about, are you already implementing anything? So here, what you want to do is work out whether you're already applying any contextual prevention strategies. So you could do this informally, just through discussions. You could do it in a meeting that could be whole of staff, or it could be a group of senior and middle management that are going to understand, right, now that we know what contextual prevention is, it has a focus on micro and macro level factors, but also it has a focus on processes and places as opposed to a focus on people. And have a think about involving all the staff in that, because again, that benchmarking and mapping exercise and involving staff can make them aware of how important safeguarding is to your organization. And I know in some of the work that we've done in research, those organizations where child safeguarding and child safety are consistent discussions are generally the ones that get that sort of better buy-in from staff in relation to changing processes. Because as Nadine pointed out, it can be a long process, it can be challenging, and we do need to bring people sort of on board that ship as we're traveling together. So as well as doing something informal, you might want to do something a bit more formal. An audit might be the next another option. So I think on the next slide we talk about nope, sorry, I've lied, it's not on the next slide, but we can get to this one. Doing some kind of audit, so something a bit more formal to understand whether you've got contextual prevention strategies happening. So again, thinking about developing some documentation for that. And of course, that documentation could be really useful if someone comes knocking on your door and says, we'd love to audit you on your safeguarding. And you'll have a range of strategies that you can say you've been implementing. And an important aspect of that, as this slide points out, would be evaluating the contextual prevention strategies that you're implementing. So in evaluating those, it might be something that you do yourself in-house, if you've got the capacity and the skills and the time amongst your staff to do that sort of thing. Equally, that's something you could apply for an external party, such as a research institute or unit with skills in this kind of area to do. It is something that we at ICPS do, and I'm sure Nadine and Sue also have done much work in this space in combination with their research. It's important to then consider, obviously, what indicators would be telling you that the strategies are working. So rather than not just saying, yes, we're implementing it, but is it actually doing what we think it's doing? And how long do you need to evaluate a strategy's effectiveness? Do you need to wait 3 months, 6 months, 12 months? What kind of time frame do you think is important? And these are some of the things that we might have to learn through some research to understand what is the time frame in which contextual prevention strategies actually show a level of effectiveness. So you may have already found some strategies and you may be able to evaluate those, but you may have identified some other risks by going through that process Sue talked about. And it might be that you go, well, here's some risks, and we don't think we're doing anything contextual prevention-wise to mitigate those risks. So what can we do? Well, you can develop some strategies. And as I said, those could be strategies that you develop with colleagues who have worked in other organizations or who have, specialized in some safeguarding and have been the champion or the lead for a while and have been going to professional development and learning about things. Or it may be that you join some kind of network or community of practice. What I would say is it's important to sort of work out, is it evidence-based? Is there a developing evidence base of research to highlight, that this is effective and it has been evaluated? Have a think about whether your contextual prevention strategies you want to develop are focused purely on environment or the place. Are they more of a social context, looking at a process that you're doing, or is it something multidimensional? And we talk about multidimensional in our contextual prevention paper that Sue was mentioning earlier. And then think about, how will you evaluate the strategy? Will you do something in-house again, just purely for yourself, or is this something that you think actually this could be something other organizations could really benefit from, and we'd love to see if there's some funding available from groups like the National Office or the National Centre, or maybe even a larger ARC or NHMRC grant to sort of say, we've got lots of contextual prevention strategies that we're developing or that we're using. We want to see if they're working, and if so, how. And I know that all of us here as researchers, Sue, Nadine, Daryl, and myself, would be very keen to identify where there's opportunities for that. And you'll get an opportunity to share your where you're at in relation to that with the feedback survey. Carleen Furman in the UK, as Sue mentioned, has numerous publications, reports, and other resources available regarding contextual prevention, keeping in mind that context might be different. And so obviously you need to have a think about, exactly how that's going to need to be adapted for your context. So find others, utilize that network. It could be communities of practice. It could be high quality resources that you find online. You don't need to necessarily reinvent the wheel, but this is a growing area in regards to safeguarding. So, you know, we might be driving around in our little mini cars at the moment. And as we sort of get that wheel, we're going to make it bigger and bigger as we find out more contextual prevention strategies. We evaluate what works about them. How long do they need to be applied for? So I think there are a lot of people interested in working in this space. And I think it's important that we look at working together and thinking about how we can create a bank of strategies that can support all communities and all organizations to be safe. I know we've got people here from sport. We've got people here from sort of more child welfare or family services organizations. I think I saw some schools, people talking about. So, you know, it's clear that this is an interest beyond just the space in which it's been developed and previously researched. And I think it's going to be great for us to collaborate in the future and look at what's going to happen moving forward. So I did mention a contextual prevention tool that goes alongside our Context Matters paper, which you can see there was published in Child Abuse Review just this year. It's an open access article, as you can see in the image there. So you can access that just by putting either the link or the title into Google, or particularly Google Scholar, and you'll be able to access that. It is a research article, of course, so it isn't always necessarily the most fun to read. So we've developed this tool, and you can see some images there, and some of those, you know, that look familiar as well. So it talks about what is contextual prevention. It also looks at the process that you will go through and give some examples of macro and micro level foci. And it also provides examples at different levels as well. So in domestic settings, in organizational settings, in community settings. And I think that the table itself is probably a good one to develop a template for, and you can mirror that for your own organization. So each setting that your organization works across, if you have different buildings or outdoor and indoor settings, and then drilling that down, thinking about the risks, as Sue said, and then looking at how you can match either existing contextual prevention strategies that you're using or finding new ones or developing new ones as well. So we will be sending out a link to the paper and a copy of the tool in the email to everyone who's registered, whether they've come to the seminar, the symposium today or not. We know a lot of people are international, as I've said, and are going to be watching the recording. You will all also receive a copy of the tool as well. So before I say thank you, shukran, gracias, and merci, I would like to point out that there's the QR code, and I'm just probably going to have to go and grab the link for the survey that leads to for Maria to put into the chat. But we would very much like to hear where you are at in your safeguarding journey, either as an individual or as an organization. The feedback is anonymous unless you put your email address in it. So there are a couple of opportunities if you would like to collaborate with us, if you'd like to talk to us about strategies that you're implementing, that we do say you can put your email address there. So in which case, obviously, please note that your feedback would not be anonymous at that point. Otherwise, in fact, I can post the link to everyone, I believe. I've just posted it in the chat there now. Otherwise, your feedback will be anonymous, and we'd be very interested to hear what you've learned in the symposium. Was the information new to you? And what are some of the things that you're looking for moving forward in the space? Because I think that the number of people who have registered and attended today tells us that this is a space worth continuing to work in for all of us. So with that said, I'm going to say thank you, and I'm going to open the floor to questions. So I know that people have been voraciously responding to questions and asking them. So please, in the chat, if there is a question that you have not had answered, or if one has come up in the last 20 or 30 minutes that you'd like, we are here to answer those. Thank you so much. We know it was an hour and a half. Thank you for The technical difficulties with the Zoom link that decided it was invalid. Thank you, Sue. We know that your voice has been troubling you with illness over the last few weeks. You sounded beautiful, so thank you. And you were sharing obviously such important information. Any questions?
Douglas, at the moment, everybody's been muted. So just wondering how we go about this. Maybe you could.
They
put some
can
of those-
definitely put questions in the chat, and
Yeah.
equally, they're probably more than likely able to unmute themselves, I'm hoping. If that's not the case, please put it in the chat, someone who is not a host or presenter.
We did have a question from Emma earlier on that I think is a really important one, and I'm happy to try and have a bit of a response to that now. Emma was asking, based on this book that I held up, which was published in the 1990s, if we've known about the need for this more comprehensive contextual kind of approach to child sexual abuse prevention, why haven't we done it before? And look, it's a really great question. I agree. Why haven't we done it before? Hence why we are on this bandwagon, and certainly why our colleagues at UniSC and ourselves are really wanting to try and get some movement happening here in Australia. But I think there's a couple of kind of broad things that we can say. One is there's a lot of kind of cultural barriers, if you like, to addressing the problem of child sexual abuse. It means understanding the breach of trust that has gone on between adults and other adolescents and children. It means prioritizing children's views and their safety. And as a society, I think we are very adult focused. And so we don't want to hear the views of children really in many different contexts, let alone about something that's so personal and confronting as a sexual behavior between an adult and a child, or one between an adolescent and another child for that matter. So there's a level of cultural denial, but also I think that we actually haven't, and I put myself in this frame here. I think as a research community and as a community involved with child sexual abuse prevention, we probably haven't done enough to actually present child sexual abuse as a preventable problem. So we have to be able to say that this is something that can be treated. If I go back to the analogy of, dental caries, we can't have dentists just saying, the problem of rotten teeth, it's a problem. We should have more focus on teeth without actually saying, and what the solutions are. So we have to be able to link the ways in which it can be preventable. But of course, even when you get to that point, understanding that it's not one simple solution, I think both Sue and Nadine made the beautiful point that, that there's a lot of strategies that we need to consider here and bring them all together. So it's hard to get the messaging across, through the media and to the broader society when there is not a simple, sole fix for this problem. But equally, it means all of us changing things. And I hope that this focus on contextual prevention recognises that the hard work can't just be following a template. We actually have to go through all of those processes that Sue did such a beautiful job of explaining to us and then illustrating with those case examples. That hard work has to be done by all, youth serving organisations. And I would say by all families, by all community groups, by all parts of society. We have to think, what are the opportunities? What are the risks in our particular setting or context? So hopefully today's presentation kind of gives us all a bit of a pause for thought around how are we actually presenting child sexual abuse as a preventable problem. And I should call out here too, it's fantastic that in Australia we now have a national strategy where many of these things are actually recognised, where we know that it's not just up to a narrow focus on stopping victimisation through, education of children and young people. But even there, we know that it's complex. And, I've got colleagues such as Tim Moore Marianne Powell, who are working with NAPCAN and other organisations to look at how we can take a trauma-informed approach to respectful relationship and consent education. So that's just one example how we have to be nuanced and adaptable in our approach to prevention. Sorry, Emma, that was a rather long answer to your beautifully crafted question of why haven't we done more since 1990? And I agree.
Thanks, Daryl. We've just had a question come through, actually. That's an interesting one. Should there be mandatory body safety and consent education for those applying for a Working with Children check? Any thoughts from any of my fellow speakers?
I'm happy to jump in here. I think it's, you know, it's helpful, but in some ways it could be distracting because, as we've been pointing out today, you know, the responsibility sits with an organisation to understand the contextual risks and therefore the contextual prevention strategies. And even if someone has undergone training, how do we actually identify that they have the right skills to be able to work in that way in our organisation? Are they attuned to the different risks? Sue, you've got your hand up.
I was just going to add to that, Daryl. I think it's a really good question. But I think there's some really fantastic sort of research being done now to unpack some of the core skills in effective safeguarding practice. And I think it's probably about are we giving our potential guardians the right knowledge in order to inform their practice? But are we also tackling the kind of the emotions that go with that, the kind of the grey areas, the confusing issues that come up for our guardians? So as we're in sort of positions of responsibility to respond to children, we know that it's not always a clear-cut kind of response, that the behaviour we see might be concerning, but is it concerning enough? We might be concerned about a particular person, but they might be my boss. How do I handle that situation? So I think there's a range of those sorts of nuances in our training of staff entering organisations that we do need to focus on. So it's not just information about sexual abuse, child sexual abuse, how it happens, but how do we navigate this complexity as an adult, as a professional in this space?
So you use the word guardian. You're not just meaning someone who's acting in the role of a parent in that legal sense, are you?
Absolutely, Daryl. I think this comes from this sort of work we're talking about here, contextual prevention, is really sitting at the interface of a number of different disciplines. And criminology is one of those disciplines. And criminology uses this term guardian as to define anybody who has the capacity to intervene to prevent any sort of crime occurring. So in this case, we're talking about people who might be able to protect a child, people who might be able to prevent somebody from engaging in abusive behaviour, or even those people that we might call place managers, people responsible for a certain setting and safety in that setting. So in terms of guardianship, we're talking about all of those people, somebody who can intervene to protect a child.
Thanks so much. Now we've got a hand up. Sangeeta, have you got a question?
No, I don't have a question. I just wanted to also add that here in Enfold, I work for Enfold. We work on prevention of child sexual abuse and sexuality education in Bangalore, India. And our child safeguarding policy is also very strong, and it is contextual. In fact, our entire program is contextual. Like, we address shame around these body parts and stuff like that, which is many a time not a concern in many Western and European countries. But I just wanted to say that we also have an informal chat with the previous employer or people known to this person who is applying to us. Because sometimes you may not write things down, a little concerning behavior, you may not put it down in the letter of recommendation or letter that you're giving to the person when they leave your job, but just asking them, is there any reason this person should not work with children? You don't have to explain the reason. Just, would you recommend that this person work with children? Something like that, not a very detailed thing, but just a hint is often enough.
Yeah, HR processes, there are definitely some that can be considered contextual because they're part of the processes. Sue, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say, I think there's some really important points. Thank you for raising those. I think that it does remind us that it's actually it is important that we're documenting concerns, but the reality is there's also sort of, the knowledge that we develop as we work in an organisation about past behaviours or past things we've witnessed or observed. And it's working out how we're going to be able to manage that information as well. So thank you for raising that and joining in.
Thanks, Sue. So I'm just going to go to Delene first.
Yeah, hi, everyone. I'm actually from Birdsville in Western Queensland, live in Brisbane, but I'm in Saudi Arabia dialing in this morning. I am committed to bringing the message around child sexual exploitation to my peers. I have a profile in Australia in agriculture. And just some suggestions is I've been speaking to practitioners in child sexual exploitation. I've been torn about how to get this message into agricultural supply chains, because everyone thinks that CSE doesn't happen in our backyard. And it's my impression that most of the work that you're doing and the people you're interacting with are practitioners that are already working in this space, or police, or AFP. And just a couple of suggestions from my point of view, I've been talking to my peers, is we think that you could get on the agenda of agricultural conferences by twisting the message and making it around modern slavery. So give the same presentation, but I can't see, your message is so important, but I can't see you getting onto panels and giving keynote presentations if you pitch yourself as, I want to speak to 1,000 people at an agricultural conference about child sexual exploitation. So I think there's an opportunity, and it wouldn't be too difficult to make you a keynote around modern slavery. I can see you in the next few years being, you and your team, being on stages, giving presentations to agriculture. And why that's important is it is happening in our backyards, but also there's a lot of money in agriculture. And I'm sure you need more money to fund your research. There's a lot of wealthy people that are involved in agriculture, and they're happy to spend their money on good things, but different. We're not hearing your message. So I've committed to delivering some toolbox training in collaboration with a not-for-profit in your sector. And so we're calling it toolbox training. And we're actually we're going to invite people and have a domestic violence lens, because again, if I pitched it as a 1-hour session on toolbox training around child sexual exploitation, no one will turn up. Even if I beg my peers, and I've got a lot of peers I can get to turn up, they won't turn up. But if I say this is an opportunity to start the process around understanding domestic violence with a perspective on children, I'm going to get 100 people in the virtual room. So just my thoughts there.
Shukran. Thank you very much. Yeah, no, it'd be great to get in touch and hear more about that, because it's great to have someone turn up and say, this really sort of area that you didn't really necessarily think about, it's relevant and there's work to be done. So yeah, no, we'll definitely get in touch and shoot you an email.
I think, Darlene, a really important point as well, going to the question that was raised before that Daryl very eloquently answered, but why hasn't there been more uptake? I think you're talking to some of those reasons. So some really great suggestions. Thank you.
Deborah, Dr. Phillips, how can we help you?
Unmute. Thank you very much. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Right. There was two comments that made me think really deeply about this matter. One was that adolescents themselves form, 14% of the known cohort of perpetrators. And yet when we look at child protection and prevention of abuse, it's rarely discussed as being something that can be done within a secondary school or large regional schools where we do have large groups of adolescents congregating. Now, that being one thing, that my work also comes out of inclusive practice and studies of disability, students with disability. When we have some units and we talk about child protection and students with disabilities being one of the most vulnerable groups in our community for sexual abuse, the undergraduate students are quite reluctant to talk about sexuality and about what they can do to prevent any forms of abuse. They do not want to discuss it. They do not want to go anywhere. They say it makes them feel uncomfortable. And I also acknowledge that because of their limited life experiences, they would have less confidence in talking about those matters. And you also mentioned, Susan, the fact is that our first year out beginning teachers do not have sufficient confidence to address this. And it may be because they are feeling extremely uncomfortable and they also do not want to provoke a situation. Some of the students say, I don't want to go in and talk about it because I might be wrong. And yet, and saying, if you see the symptoms, if you see the flags, then you really should be moving this along to your supervisor. So I am interested in what we can do within that space at initial teacher education level, especially to give our undergraduates sufficient knowledge and to feel confident that they can address the matter quite factually without any emotion and without bringing in any of the emotional religious mores that they would have as well.
It's some great points there. I can attest to the fact that we need that, not necessarily through personal experience, although I was a teacher for 10 years and I graduated at 20. So I was potentially going to be in a classroom at the age of 20 and I taught primary. So any discussion there, which I think is needed in a developmentally appropriate way, would probably have been easier as a 20-year-old than if I was teaching secondary, admittedly. Mm-hmm. But yeah, no, I completely agree that initial teacher training is a really important space for us to be making sure there is confidence. And some of the work that we do at ICPS is very much analysing the confidence of people in different workforces in relation to preventing sexual abuse. And confidence consistently ranks as the poorest of the 4 domains of capabilities that we measure, which is against awareness, knowledge, and attitudes. So yeah, no, definitely keen to take this discussion on, and look at how we can do something potentially at ACU with some of the trainees we're doing, and then looking at scaling that up for other universities' curriculums. Yeah, I'd definitely be interested in talking about that. And I think the disability space, I see you asked a question and I know there was some answers to that, I believe. The International Safeguarding Conference in Rome next month has a focus on disability. Yep. I know we've been approached at ICPS to have a focus on looking at harmful sexual behaviour in neurodiverse young people. So again, I think that along with contextual prevention is another growing space where we're realising there's more that needs to be done. We need to do some research, get some tools to implement for practitioners. And again, I think beyond what Daryl has pointed out in some of his answers to other questions about, the difficulty in society for some people to discuss matters of sexuality, especially in relation to children, I think that disability is an added layer. So if you're a disabled child, you're that person that you've got 2 factors that adults are thinking, oh no, we can't talk about sex with them. So I want to be that person that just starts mini presentations by, screaming out penis and vagina and so forth, and getting people to realize that, we don't necessarily need to feel uncomfortable talking about those sorts of things.
Yeah. Can I just jump in as well? I think really, really important points that you're making. Deborah, two things really stood out for me. I think for young teachers, it's about having a framework to assist them to respond to that behaviour. And I think there are a couple that have been developed, actually not, one of them not in this field as such, but I think there are some simple frameworks that we could teach young teachers to be able to use. But I think outside of that, it also highlights really the role that contextual prevention can play while you're building your confidence, while you're building your competence, while you're undertaking training. There's a whole lot of things you could do in your classroom to set your classroom up to create safety as you're building those sorts of skills. So I think it again is just a lovely opportunity for me to highlight that really we're looking at a comprehensive approach, contextual prevention being one aspect of a larger sort of approach. But yeah, thank you for raising that. I think it's a really, really big area of need.
Thanks so much, Sue. And I can see Nadine's just replied to Jeanette's question about have we found putting in place contextual prevention strategies assists to minimize grooming due to increased visibility, and does it lead to more curiosity of observed behaviours and discussions, and the burden of raising concern that Dr. Phillips just mentioned. Again, I think our safeguarding capabilities survey data that we have here at ICPS, we have a report for 2018 to 2020, and we will be working on a report in the next few months for data collected between 2021 to 2023. One of the consistent, again, findings that we have in that report and in that survey data is that professionals in organisations that work with children feel very unconfident to raise concerns about a colleague's behaviour if it falls within outside of the code of conduct. They are, I guess, worried about being wrong. They're worried about the implications. They're worried about potentially, friendships with their colleagues and what's going to happen to them. We would need some research in and of itself to identify what is causing that low score. So we'll look to be getting that report out hopefully in August or September this year. And it will have some interesting findings. The working with children checks, which were mentioned earlier, again, is a very consistent finding that many people in organisations think that's enough. As long as we've got everyone with working with children checks, we don't need to really be doing much else to keep children safe. So there's definitely some issues there that we need to face in regards to it. So hopefully Dr. Phillips and ourselves can get onto that, at least in the education sector, and then scale that up into other sectors as well. So I'm not sure that the chat is moving so quickly. It's actually quite difficult to track these questions. Has anyone else got a question that they would like us to answer? Please feel free to raise your hand or write it in.
Can I just go back to Jeanette's question, because I think it's a great one. I think we've got to think about intended and unintended consequences of these types of strategies. And I think interesting from a rational choice perspective, a lot of the sort of larger campaigns that we have, community-based campaigns, a number of these types of strategies not only reduce opportunity, but they actually send messages of prevention and deterrence to potential perpetrators. So again, goes back to Dr. Phillips' point as well, that what is a simple measure that Matt was talking about before as well. I mean, this open communication, it's a really complex thing. I don't think it's a simple thing, but it's an open communication, being able to have difficult conversations when there are concerns. And the fact that actually by having those conversations, we create a resilient community where people feel less confident to actually target or look at engaging young people because the vulnerabilities aren't there. So the system's not vulnerable. The people who safeguard those children are not vulnerable, and the children themselves then are more resilient. And I think it's an unintended aspect of this work, but a fantastic consequence of this work is it's not just about directly targeting the environment, but indirectly targeting the messaging that comes with these types of approaches that essentially make potential perpetrators concerned about actually engaging in behaviour in that place because the risk is so much higher.
Thanks, Nadine.
Hi,
So,
Douglas, it's Melinda. Sorry, I can't work out how to put my hand up, but can I ask a question?
of course you can.
Thank you. Amazing presentation. Just so much information. I've just got a reflection as a parent as well as a worker in this space. So, you know, I've got a 12-year-old daughter who engages in regular kind of community activities. She goes to school, she goes to sporting clubs, etc., etc. And I feel like some of those mainstream settings that all children interact with in some way or another are a real key to this. And thinking about what are the broader cultural considerations for those big organisations, some of them those big workforces who are not specialist workforces in, you know, child safety. And what is the role of sort of culture change in child safety? So, you know, how do organisations view children? How do they talk about children? Do they believe children when children make a complaint? Those kinds of considerations. If I think about my local council runs a couple of swimming pools, a fitness centre, several childcare centres. There's a big workforce in those kinds of organisations around the country that you know, provide services to children every day. I'm just interested in your reflections about, I feel like sometimes those cultural aspects are the place to start. When you hear or see concerning things, not necessarily about the sexual abuse of children, but how they respond to children, talk about children, view children, are able or not able to share power with children, etc.
Yeah, I definitely think that there's different sectors, if we use that term, are definitely at different levels of, you know, sections of the journey of safeguarding. I mean, I think what's really interesting is you mentioned the local council, and I know pre-COVID, there was a group in Melbourne that they had safeguarding leads at councils, and they would meet regularly to share ideas and so forth. So there's definitely work happening. I know that certain councils are you know, contacting research institutes like ours to look at, you know, either collecting data so that they can understand where people across the council are in relation to safeguarding, or, you know, thinking about how they can involve and find out more from children and young people. And obviously it's so different across different sectors. It's very easy at a school where young people are you know, hopefully at school, if it's a safe place for them 5 days a week, you know, 8 hours a day or so. You know, sports, for example, is a completely different ball game, excuse the pun, because a lot of the workforce are volunteers. And you know, so there's all these different contextual factors. I mean, we're just full of puns and ironies today, that are going to play a role as to whether or not, and how, not, it shouldn't be whether or not, it should be how, and in what way we can implement safeguarding strategies and improve the culture of safeguarding across, you know, cultural institutes, educational institutes, you know, family and child focused, you know, service institutes. So there's a lot to be done, but there are organizations much like your own that we know are, you know, spearheading some of the work, who are involved in you know, doing funded work. So yeah, hopefully we'll be able to do some more work. I know that Aurelie is here, you know, with a big focus on sport, and I know that we're doing some work in that space as well. And so it would be great to you know, to look at what's happening there. I know Sport Integrity Australia are trying to get everyone on board, you know, and it's so disaggregated with the national bodies, the state bodies, and things like that.
Douglas,
so lots happening. Daryl, go on.
I think Melinda raises a really good point about kind of cross-sectoral collaboration. I think is one of the solutions, if you like, to the problem that you've highlighted, that, you know, there's a lot going on in spaces. And I think that many kind of child and family welfare organisations, specialist organisations, have some real skills in understanding things like, you know, empowerment and participation of children, in having sensitive conversations about tricky topics. But how do we get that skill set into the places where most children are, because not that many children engage with a specialist, you know, kind of child and family welfare organisation. So I think we actually have to find ways of getting engagement between that sector, which has a lot of skills and can provide mentoring and support for that broader skill set, who may never quite be as expert at it as the kind of specialists. But if they were located in similar places and perhaps adopted different practice models that had more of a kind of a coaching and support role of those who were on the front line. And we've had lots of comments in the chat about, you know, the importance of schools and teachers and so forth. You know, but you've raised some of the lovely examples, Melinda, of, you know, sports clubs, you know, of places like pools, libraries are a great one. You know, there's all sorts of things that we can be doing if we kind of mobilize and get these skills coming together.
Daryl, I think I'm saying it right. Ureli had asked a question of you quite early on in the team that sort of fits into this, and she's just made another comment as well. I just wondered if you could address it. It's around, did you control for the fact that in your study, you were talking about specific institutions, churches, sports or church, whether they boys experience more than girls.
Yeah.
If you did control for the fact that much more boys participate in some institutions than others, for example, sports participation by boys is twice higher. I think it's an interesting question.
Yeah, look, the methodology of the Australian Child Maltreatment Study was not about taking places and understanding what is the risk within a particular place, but taking a representative sample of the entire population, aged 16 and over, and asking how often, how many people had experienced child sexual abuse, and then for everyone who said yes, asking more detailed questions about who it was that harmed them and any information about where it was. So we don't have that information to be able to say about one particular sports code versus another. All we can say is that organisational contexts were relatively low compared to the prevalence of child sexual abuse in other contexts.
Thanks
Thanks so much. Well, thank you, everyone. It is past 2 o'clock here on the eastern seaboard of Australia. So thank you so much. Again, there's that QR code, and I know that Maria did just put the link in the chat. We would love to hear your feedback. We would love to get in touch and find out, you know, what's happening in regards to contextual prevention. And to the researchers, to the doctors in the room, we would love to get in touch with you also and see where we can collaborate, because I think you all have sectors and specialities that, you know, would help us all to come together. Thank you very much, everyone, and looking forward to seeing you again soon. Enjoy the rest of your day.